I never meant to hear the words that changed my life. Say one more thing about Noah, and you can forget we were ever friends. Ethan's voice cut through the laughter on the other side of the kitchen door, calm enough to make everyone else fall silent, sharp enough to make my heart stop. I froze with my hand wrapped around the sleeve of my jacket, hidden in the narrow hallway outside the apartment's crowded kitchen, suddenly afraid that even breathing too loudly would ruin whatever impossible moment I had stumbled into. Brandon let out a short, awkward laugh, the kind people used when they realized they had pushed a joke too far. Come on, man. We're just messing around. Ethan didn't laugh back. No, you're making someone I care about into entertainment. That's not the same thing. Every word landed harder than the last because Ethan didn't know I was standing there. If he had known, he would have changed the subject. He always protected me in quiet ways, never loud enough for anyone else to notice, never obvious enough for me to believe they meant anything beyond friendship. I should have walked away. I should have grabbed my jacket and disappeared before anyone saw me. Instead, I stayed rooted to the floor, listening to the one conversation I had spent 9 years convincing myself would never happen. 9 years is a strange amount of time to love someone who insists they're straight. Long enough to memorize the sound of their footsteps before they reach your front door. Long enough to know they drink black coffee on Mondays because they never sleep well after football weekends. Long enough to recognize the tiny wrinkle beside their left eye whenever they're trying not to smile. Ethan Walker had been my best friend since sophomore year of high school, back when we were two awkward 16-year-olds paired together for a history project neither of us wanted to do. Somehow that assignment became late-night study sessions, then weekend road trips, then birthdays, holidays, apartment keys, emergency contacts, and every important memory in between. Somewhere along the way, he became home. Somewhere along the way, I made the worst decision of my life. I fell in love with him and never told him. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a movie moment or a sudden realization under fireworks. It happened quietly, one ordinary day after another, until I couldn't remember what it felt like not to love him. I buried it because Ethan never hid who he was. Whenever someone teased us about acting like a married couple, he would grin, throw an arm over my shoulder, and say the same sentence every single time. Relax. I'm straight. He always said it with a smile, completely harmless, completely honest, and every single time I smiled back as if those two words didn't quietly undo me. Tonight was supposed to be another celebration of his life. His promotion had finally become official, and everyone from his office wanted to throw him a party. I almost declined the invitation. Crowded apartments, loud music, and strangers had never been my favorite combination, but Ethan had called me that morning and promised, just show up. If it gets overwhelming, we'll leave together. I believed him because I always believed him. I just never imagined the night would begin with me overhearing my straight best friend defending me, as if losing everyone else in the room mattered less than letting one cruel sentence reach my ears. Time seemed to stretch until every second felt painfully clear. I heard someone clear his throat, another person mutter that everyone needed to relax, but nobody challenged Ethan again. I wanted to believe I had imagined everything. It would have been easier if those words had been nothing more than wishful thinking from someone who had spent far too many nights hoping for impossible things. Instead, I heard footsteps moving toward the hallway. Panic rushed through me. I grabbed my jacket from the hook beside the laundry room and slipped through the front door before anyone could see me. The cool evening air hit my face, carrying the faint smell of rain, even though the forecast had promised a clear night. My hands would not stop shaking. I walked without paying attention to where I was going, passing rows of parked cars and quiet apartment buildings while replaying Ethan's voice over and over again. You do not get to make Noah feel ashamed. I had imagined Ethan saying 1,000 different things over the years. I had imagined him rejecting me kindly. I had imagined him laughing because he thought I was joking. I had imagined him apologizing because he could never feel the same way. I had never imagined him standing in a room full of coworkers and choosing my dignity over fitting in with everyone else. That was the part one could not understand. Ethan had always been well-liked. People naturally followed him because he listened before speaking, remembered birthdays, and somehow made everyone feel important without trying too hard. He rarely argued with anyone. He preferred solving problems quietly instead of creating scenes. Yet tonight he had willingly made the room uncomfortable because someone had crossed a line involving me. My phone vibrated in my pocket before I reached the end of the block. Ethan. I stared at his name until the screen went dark. A second later, another message appeared. Where did you go? I typed 3 different replies before deleting every one of them. Finally, I settled on the safest lie I could think of. I was tired. I headed home early. Almost immediately, the typing bubble appeared. Are you okay? Such a simple question, for words that should have been easy to answer. Instead, I locked my phone without responding because I did not know what okay even meant anymore. When I reached my apartment, everything looked exactly the way I had left it that afternoon. The small bookshelf by the window. The faded blue couch Ethan had helped me carry up 3 flights of stairs 2 summers ago. The framed photo from our road trip to Maine sitting beside the television. We looked happy in that picture. Ethan had his arm thrown casually around my shoulders while I laughed at something outside the frame. Anyone looking at it would see 2 best friends. Only I knew that the smile on my face had been hiding a heart already far too attached. I dropped my keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, but one key remained in my hand. It was the spare key to Ethan's apartment. He had given it to me years earlier after locking himself out twice in the same month. Keep it forever, he had joked. You are more responsible than I am. I turned the key over between my fingers and realized something that unsettled me even more than the conversation I had overheard. For years, I had been terrified that telling Ethan the truth would destroy our friendship. Tonight, for the very first time, I was equally terrified that staying silent might destroy it instead. Sleep never came that night. I lay on my couch staring at the ceiling while the digital clock on the microwave quietly changed from 11:48 to 12:13, then 1:27, then 2:51. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice again, steady and unwavering, defending me when he thought I would never know. By sunrise, I had convinced myself of one thing. Whatever had happened at the party did not change reality. Ethan was still Ethan. He was still the man who had spent years reminding everyone that he was straight whenever they joked about us. One emotional moment could not erase nearly a decade of certainty. That thought should have comforted me. Instead, it made my chest feel heavier. Around 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Good morning. Did you make it home safely? I smiled before I could stop myself. That was the problem with loving Ethan. Even the smallest message could brighten my day, and I hated giving him that much power over my emotions. I answered with the truth this time. Yes, I made it home. Thank you. His reply appeared almost instantly. I am bringing coffee. Do not argue. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Before I could think of a reason to stop him, another message arrived. 10 minutes. My apartment suddenly felt much smaller. I looked around and noticed the blanket tossed across the couch, yesterday's mail scattered on the kitchen counter, and a coffee mug still sitting in the sink. Normally, none of it would matter because Ethan had seen my apartment in every possible condition over the years. Today, everything felt different because I was no longer sure I knew how to look at him. Exactly 10 minutes later came the familiar knock, 3 quick taps followed by one slower one. Ethan had always knocked that way. I opened the door, and there he stood, holding 2 paper coffee cups from the neighborhood cafe we always visited on Saturday mornings. His dark hair looked slightly messy, and there were faint circles beneath his eyes. He looked like someone who had not slept much either. You look terrible, he said with the kind of teasing smile that had always made difficult days easier. You should see the other guy. I replied automatically before realizing how strange that sounded. Ethan laughed softly and handed me my drink without asking what I wanted because he already knew. Medium vanilla latte with oat milk, no whipped cream. Exactly the way I had ordered it for years. We stood in awkward silence for several seconds after stepping inside. That had never happened before. Usually Ethan filled my apartment with easy conversation the moment he arrived. Today he seemed to be searching for words that refused to come. Finally he looked at me and asked, "Did something happen last night?" The question caught me off guard because it sounded so careful. Not accusatory, not suspicious, almost hopeful. My heart pounded as I searched his face for any sign that he knew I had overheard everything. There was nothing obvious there, only concern. I could have told him the truth. I could have admitted that I had heard every word through the kitchen door. I could have thanked him for standing up for me. Instead, fear won again. I forced a small smile and shook my head. Nothing happened. I just got overwhelmed and left early. Ethan studied me for a long moment, his gray eyes refusing to look away. Then he nodded once, but I recognized that expression. It was the same look he wore whenever he knew I was hiding something and decided not to push me before I was ready. As he wrapped both hands around his untouched coffee cup, he quietly said, "I wish you would let me help carry whatever you are carrying." I looked down at the warm cup in my hands because if I met his eyes for even one more second, I was afraid every secret I had protected for 9 years would finally spill into the open. The rest of that morning passed in the strange, careful rhythm that only existed between two people who knew each other almost too well. Ethan stayed for nearly an hour, talking about ordinary things as if ordinary things could somehow repair whatever invisible crack had appeared between us. He complained about the endless paperwork that came with his promotion, joked that his new office coffee tasted like burned cardboard, and asked if I wanted to join him for our usual Saturday grocery run. Normally, I would have said yes without thinking. Instead, I told him I already had plans. It was the first lie I had ever told simply to avoid spending time alone with him. I watched the disappointment flicker across his face before he covered it with a polite smile. "Another time," he said quietly. After he left, I leaned against the closed front door and let out a slow breath I had been holding since he arrived. Distance. That was the only answer I could think of. If I kept seeing him every weekend, sharing dinners, movies, and late-night phone calls, nothing inside me would ever change. I had spent years convincing myself that loving someone silently was enough. Now that I knew how fiercely he had defended me, silence had become unbearable. Over the next several days I answered his messages, but only hours after they arrived. When he invited me to lunch, I blamed work. When he asked if I wanted to watch the baseball game at his apartment, I claimed I was exhausted. None of the excuses were completely false, but none of them were the real reason either. The truth was much simpler. Every time I looked at Ethan, I heard those words again, and they filled me with hope that I could not afford. By Thursday afternoon, my phone rang instead of buzzing with another text. I knew it was him before I even looked at the screen. I answered after the third ring. "Hey," I said. "Noah," Ethan replied, and I immediately noticed the concern in his voice. Did I do something wrong? My heart sank. "What do you mean? You have canceled on me 3 times this week. You answer messages like you are talking to a stranger. If you are upset with me, I would rather you tell me than disappear." I closed my eyes because hearing the word disappear hurt more than I expected. Ethan had always feared losing people he cared about. His father had moved across the country after his parents divorced when he was 12, and although they still spoke occasionally, Ethan once admitted that unanswered messages always made him anxious. I knew that better than almost anyone. Yet here I was becoming exactly the silence he hated. "I am just busy," I whispered. There was a long pause on the line. "No," Ethan answered gently. "You are protecting yourself from something, and I do not know what it is." I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to admit that hearing him defend me had shattered every wall I had carefully built around my heart. I wanted to ask why he had cared so much, why his voice had sounded so personal, why he had never denied Brandon's accusation the way he always denied everyone else's jokes. Instead, I swallowed every question because I was terrified of the answers. "I think I just need a little space," I finally said. The silence that followed felt endless. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "If space is what you need, I will respect that." He hesitated before adding one sentence that stayed with me long after the call ended. "Just promise me you are not trying to teach yourself how to live without me, because I do not think I remember how to live without you." For the next week, I kept my promise to give us space, but every mile I tried to place between us somehow circled back to Ethan. I left work through a different exit because I knew he sometimes stopped by the cafe across the street after meetings. I skipped our favorite diner on Friday night and ordered takeout instead. Even the grocery store felt unfamiliar because I avoided the aisle where he always insisted on comparing cereal boxes for reasons neither of us could explain. I told myself I was doing the right thing. If I could learn to stand on my own before my feelings grew any stronger, maybe I could save the friendship we still had. The problem was that every ordinary part of my life seemed to carry his fingerprints. Saturday afternoon, I volunteered at the community center where I spent a few hours every month helping organize donations for local families. It was usually the one place. That quieted my thoughts. People came and went with boxes of clothes, canned food, and school supplies, grateful for simple acts of kindness that reminded me the world could still be gentle. I had almost convinced myself I was finally finding that peace again when I heard someone call my name from across the parking lot. I turned before I could stop myself. Ethan was jogging toward the entrance, carrying 2 large donation boxes in his arms. He looked surprised to see me, but the surprise quickly became something closer to relief. "I did not know you volunteered here," he said, setting the boxes on a folding table. "You never asked," I answered with a smile that felt easier than any smile I had managed all week. One of the coordinators thanked Ethan for the supplies, and I watched him greet every volunteer with the same quiet respect he showed everyone. That was who Ethan had always been. He never looked for recognition. He simply noticed where help was needed and stepped in before anyone asked. For a while we worked on opposite sides of the room, sorting donations into labeled bins. Neither of us forced conversation. Strangely, the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt familiar, the comfortable kind we had shared countless times while driving long highways or assembling cheap furniture that always came with too many screws. Late in the afternoon, a teenage volunteer accidentally knocked over a stack of storage boxes. Papers scattered across the floor, and several people rushed over to help gather them. As I bent down to pick up a folder, another volunteer smiled and asked, "So how long have you two been together?" The question was innocent, asked with genuine warmth instead of mockery, but my entire body froze. Before I could answer, Ethan looked at me instead of the volunteer. There was no quick laugh, no automatic correction, no familiar sentence creating distance between us. His expression softened with a hesitation I had never seen before. Finally, he answered quietly, "We have been in each other's lives for 9 years." The volunteer smiled, apparently satisfied, and returned to stacking boxes without realizing how unusual that answer had been. I remained kneeling on the floor with a folder still in my hands, unable to breathe normally. Ethan had not lied. He also had not hidden behind the words he had repeated for years whenever anyone misunderstood our closeness. As the room slowly returned to its busy rhythm, he reached down and offered me his hand to help me stand. Our eyes met for only a second, but in that silent moment I realized something had changed. I no longer knew whether Ethan was protecting my heart, protecting his own, or quietly beginning to stop protecting either of us. After everyone finished sorting the last of the donations, the volunteers slowly gathered their things and headed toward the parking lot. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the pavement, and for a brief moment I thought I might leave before Ethan caught up with me. I almost made it to my car when I heard my name behind me. "Noah, wait." His voice was calm, but there was something different underneath it, something that sounded less like confidence and more like determination. I stopped walking without turning around. A few seconds later, he stood beside me, holding his car keys loosely in one hand. Neither of us spoke immediately. We had never needed to fill every silence between us, but this one carried questions that neither of us seemed brave enough to ask. Finally, Ethan smiled, though it was smaller than usual. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked. I hesitated before nodding. We crossed the quiet park next to the community center, following a paved path that circled a small pond where families were feeding ducks and children laughed from a nearby playground. It was peaceful enough that I almost forgot how anxious I had been all week. Ethan kept his hands in the pockets of his light jacket as we walked side by side. He looked straight ahead instead of at me. "I have been thinking about our phone call," he admitted. "You said you needed space, and I told myself I should respect that. But every day felt wrong." He paused, searching for words. "I kept reaching for my phone because something funny happened at work or I found a restaurant I thought you would like, and then I remembered I was supposed to leave you alone." I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the path beneath us. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," he answered immediately. "That is why it confused me. You always tell me when something is bothering you. This time you did not." We continued walking until we reached a wooden bench overlooking the water. Ethan sat down first, and after a moment I joined him. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and somewhere behind us a baseball game had just started on one of the community fields. Everything around us felt wonderfully ordinary, which only made the conversation ahead seem more frightening. Ethan rested his elbows on his knees and let out a quiet breath. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "At the party, did you leave because of something that happened?" My heart immediately began racing. I had prepared myself for this question every day since that night, yet now that it had finally come, every answer seemed impossible. I could lie again. I could protect both of us with another excuse. Or I could tell the truth and risk changing everything we had spent 9 years building together. I looked out across the pond where the evening sunlight shimmered across the surface like scattered pieces of glass. "Why are you asking?" I whispered. Ethan was silent for several long seconds before answering. "Because after you left, nobody could tell me where you had gone. Brandon apologized to me for making things uncomfortable, and that made me realize you might have heard more than I thought." My breath caught before I could hide it. Ethan slowly turned toward me, his expression filled not with fear or embarrassment, but quiet concern. "Noah," he said softly, "did you hear what was said in that kitchen?" I closed my eyes because after days of running from the truth, I finally understood there was no distance large enough to keep it from catching up with us. I kept my eyes closed for a few more seconds because pretending not to hear the question felt easier than answering it. When I finally looked at Ethan again, I saw something I had not expected. He was nervous. The man who could walk into a boardroom full of executives without losing his composure suddenly looked uncertain sitting beside me on an old wooden bench. I let out a slow breath. "Yes," I said quietly. "I heard everything." Ethan did not speak. He simply nodded once, almost as if he had been preparing himself for that answer ever since the night of the party. I went back for my jacket. I continued. "I heard Brandon talking about me, and then I heard you." The silence stretched between us, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt honest. I stared at the ripples moving across the pond because looking at the water was easier than looking at him. "Thank you," I whispered. "Nobody has ever stood up for me like that before." Ethan frowned gently. "Someone should have." I smiled sadly. "Maybe. But people usually decide it is easier to laugh along than make everyone uncomfortable." "I am not everyone," he replied without hesitation. His answer settled into the quiet air around us. It was such a simple sentence, yet it carried more weight than either of us acknowledged out loud. I laughed softly, though there was very little humor in it. "That is exactly the problem." Ethan turned toward me. "What does that mean?" I rubbed my hands together, trying to find courage in a gesture that offered none. "It means you have always treated me differently. You remember things nobody else remembers. You always know when I am pretending to be fine. You show up with my favorite coffee without asking. Then you tell the world you are straight, and I spend months reminding myself that I imagined everything else." Ethan lowered his head, saying nothing. For the first time since we had met as teenagers, I could not read what he was thinking. "I started avoiding you because I could not separate what I heard that night from what I have felt for years," I admitted. "Every time I looked at you afterward, I kept wondering if I had misunderstood our friendship or if I had misunderstood myself." Ethan slowly shook his head. "You did not misunderstand our friendship." I looked at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence, but it never came. Instead, he let out a quiet breath and stared across the pond. "Do you know what Brandon asked me after you left?" he said. I nodded. "He asked why you cared so much." Ethan gave a faint smile that disappeared almost immediately. "I have replayed that question every day since then." His voice became almost painfully honest. "For years I always had an answer ready whenever people joked about us. I never even had to think about it. But that night..." He stopped speaking and pressed both hands together. "That night I realized I could not say those same words anymore without feeling like I was lying to someone." My heartbeat echoed so loudly in my ears that I barely heard the children laughing near the playground behind us. Ethan was still not looking at me. It was as though admitting even that much had taken everything he had. After another long silence, he quietly said, "I do not know exactly what that means yet. I only know that when I thought you were pulling away from me, I was more afraid than I have been in a very long time." I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, not because everything had suddenly become clear, but because for the first time in 9 years neither of us was hiding behind easy answers anymore. Neither of us spoke for what felt like several minutes. The quiet between us no longer felt like something to escape. It felt like a place where two people were finally allowing the truth to exist without rushing to explain it away. I looked down at my hands and laughed softly, mostly at myself. "I spent years preparing for you to reject me," I admitted. "I never prepared for this." Ethan looked over with a tired smile. "This? You telling me that you do not have all the answers?" He nodded slowly. "I wish I did." We sat there watching the sunlight drift across the pond until Ethan quietly said, "Can I tell you something that I have never admitted out loud?" I turned toward him. "Of course." He took a slow breath before speaking. "After you asked for space, I went looking for reasons that would make your behavior make sense. He smiled to himself, almost embarrassed. I even convinced myself you were secretly dating someone and did not know how to tell me. I blinked in surprise. Really? He laughed once. It sounded ridiculous the more I thought about it, but I could not understand why losing a few lunches together suddenly felt like someone had taken an entire part of my life away. He rubbed the back of his neck before continuing. A few days ago I was cleaning out my car because I thought staying busy might help. His eyes drifted toward the water again. I found an old cardboard box that you forgot after our trip to Maine a few years ago. My heart skipped. The memory box? I did not open it because I wanted to invade your privacy, he said quickly. The lid had already come loose. I covered my face with one hand. That is somehow even worse. Ethan chuckled gently. There were ticket stubs, postcards, photographs, and little notes. Every single one reminded me of something we had done together. At first I thought it was sweet that you saved all those memories. His smile faded into something more thoughtful. Then I went home and realized I had done exactly the same thing. I looked at him in disbelief. What do you mean? I have a drawer in my apartment that I have never really thought about. It has the receipt from the diner where we celebrated your first promotion, the scorecard from the baseball game where it rained the entire ninth inning, the birthday card you made me when we were 21 because you said store-bought cards were boring. I even kept the keychain you won for me at the county fair, even though it has been missing the little compass for years. He let out a quiet breath. I always told myself those things mattered because you were my best friend. His voice softened. Maybe they still do. But I finally had to ask myself why every important memory I chose to keep somehow had you standing right beside me. My eyes filled with tears before I even realized it. Ethan looked directly at me for the first time since we sat down on the bench. I do not think my feelings appeared overnight, he said. I think I buried them under answers that made life simpler. It was easier to believe I understood myself than to question why losing you felt impossible. My heart ached in the gentlest way imaginable. I reached over without thinking and rested my hand lightly against his. I was ready for him to pull away, to panic, to apologize for everything he had just shared. Instead, his fingers slowly turned until they met mine, not with certainty, but with quiet intention, and in that small, trembling moment, I realized neither of us was trying to become someone new. We were finally allowing ourselves to recognize who we had been all along. We stayed on that bench until the sun slipped behind the trees and the lights around the park flickered to life one by one. Neither of us rushed to define what had just happened, because for the first time in years, neither of us felt the need to hide behind convenient answers. Ethan was still holding my hand, not tightly, not possessively, just enough to remind me that he had not let go. After a while, he smiled in that familiar way that had always made difficult days feel a little lighter. Do you remember what you told me after my first job interview? He asked. I laughed quietly. You were convinced you had failed. I was convinced my life was over. And I told you that one bad day could not decide your future. Ethan nodded. You were right then. He looked at me with an honesty that made my chest ache. I think the opposite is also true. One confusing week does not have to decide ours. His words settled over me like the first warm day after a long winter. I realized that I had spent so much time fearing rejection that I had never imagined another possibility. We did not have to solve every question before taking one small step forward together. We left the park and walked toward the parking lot at an easy pace, our conversation drifting back to familiar subjects. We joked about the terrible coffee in Ethan's office, argued over which baseball stadium had the best hot dogs, and laughed about the camping trip where we had accidentally pitched our tent backward. The stories were the same ones we had told dozens of times before, but somehow they sounded different now because neither of us was pretending those memories belonged to ordinary friendship alone. Just before we reached our cars, Ethan stopped walking. There is something else I need to do, he said. Before I could ask what he meant, Brandon stepped out of the community center carrying a stack of empty storage bins toward his truck. He noticed us and offered an awkward wave before clearly debating whether to come closer. Ethan made the decision for him by walking over first. I followed a few steps behind. Brandon looked uncomfortable. Listen, he began. I know things got weird at the party. Ethan shook his head gently. I am not here to argue. He glanced toward me before continuing. I just want to make something clear. Noah deserves respect whether he is standing in the room or not. I should have made that obvious a long time ago. Brandon nodded quietly. You are right. I was trying to be funny, and I was not thinking about how it would sound. He turned to me. I am sorry, Noah. I accepted the apology with a small nod because it felt sincere, but the moment was no longer about what had happened at the party. It was about what Ethan chose to do afterward. He did not defend me because I needed someone to rescue me. He defended me because kindness deserved a voice even when it was inconvenient. As Brandon drove away, Ethan turned back toward me with a nervous smile. I still have a lot to figure out, he admitted. I cannot promise I will always have the perfect words. I smiled through tears that no longer came from heartbreak. I do not need perfect words. He stepped a little closer, his eyes never leaving mine. Then let me promise you something I know I can keep. He took my hand again, with the same quiet certainty as before. No more pretending. No more hiding behind answers that are easier than the truth. I do not know every part of what comes next, but I know I want to discover it with you. For the first time in 9 years, I did not have to imagine what hope sounded like. I was standing right in front of it, and this time, neither of us walked away.